Hello, pattern readers. For this video on episode 6 of The Rings of Power, I'm doing something a little bit different for you. So I wanted to bring you a little snippet of something that I do on another YouTube channel. So if you're not aware, I also am part of a channel called What the Adaptation. And on that channel, there's always a group panel that discusses, so far it's been TV shows, but really it could be any adaptation from one medium to another. So we have been discussing The Rings of Power as an adaptation of Tolkien's writings. And so it's a different format, usually a longer form discussion, but I'm bringing you an edited down version of that just so you can kind of get some of the highlights and a sense of the kinds of things you would get to see on that channel. In the most recent video, I was on with two of my regular co-hosts, Glenn and Max, and then we also had a special guest on, Dr. Philip Chase from the YouTube channel of the same name. It was a great conversation, so I wanted you to get to see part of that and hopefully encourage you to check out that channel if you were interested in adaptations. Before we get to that, I also wanted to discuss a little bit about one character that I have a lot of thoughts on after episode 6. And this character, I think, is going to be really crucial. However they choose to handle Halbrand, whether he is Sauron, whether he isn't Sauron, either way, it's becoming clear how important this character is going to be to the narrative, and how they handle it is going to really, I think, impact my overall enjoyment of this season. So I wanted to share some thoughts about it. I've talked about the theory that Halbrand could be Sauron from the beginning. Very popular theory. All along, I haven't really been convinced by it, and I think a lot of that had to do with it initially being a little too obvious, kind of seeming like a red herring. There wasn't a really strong case for him, but yet there was a lot of little bits of evidence that seemed to be stacking up. Then as we get further into the season, I think we've seen enough moments of Halbrand where he truly does seem to be a conflicted individual. We've seen him in moments where he is not manipulating anyone, where he is alone and struggling with his decisions. How can we reconcile a Sauron who seems genuinely morally conflicted? Genuinely seems to have some guilt. This is definitely a gray character, and that's not necessarily how we think of Sauron at all. Now, in the Tolkien lore, there is some indication that Sauron may have gone through a period like that, following the defeat of Morgoth. So this could be consistent. Nevertheless, it's still a very hard sell, and it's something that the show really has to get right if they're going in that direction. Another thing to consider, if it does turn out that Halbrand is Sauron, is whatever is going on with the elves, Gil-galad and Celebrimbor. To me, it seems very clear that someone has been manipulating them, and I have been assuming that whoever it is Sauron. If it's Halbrand, it's pretty hard to see how he could also be manipulating them. And if it was just something he did in the past, before he ended up on a raft in the middle of the ocean, well, maybe. It's just a little bit harder, again, to sell that. And I do truly believe there is manipulation happening that's affecting the elves. So they need to explain that somehow. Now, if Halbrand is not Sauron, then I think they still need to do some explaining, because they have hinted at it enough. And more importantly, they've set him up with such importance, in my opinion, that they also need to really land whatever story direction they are going in for him. I am going to link you to a Twitter thread that I thought was really interesting, and it kind of brings together, I think, the strongest arguments I've seen for why Halbrand might be Sauron. And to me, these arguments are stronger because they're more focused on thematic elements, character-driven reasons, and they bring in some of the Tolkien lore that might support this. So it's more than just, oh, he has rings incorporated into his costume and little details like that, which may or may not be misleading. So at this point, I'm still unsure whether he will turn out to be Sauron. I'm unsure whether I think it's a good idea for him to turn out to be Sauron. And it all depends on the execution at the end of this season, because I'm kind of assuming by the end of the season, we're going to know whether Halbrand is Sauron or not. But we'll see. I'll be surprised if we don't have a clearer idea by the end of the season. But either way, I think how they execute that is hugely important, and is going to affect how I feel about the season overall. Curious to know your thoughts. Now, I do hope you enjoy these snippets from what the adaptations discussion of episode 6. I will hope you check out that channel and consider subscribing and come back here for more Rings of Power coverage. And because we're going to be getting some Wheel of Time news soon, I'm going to be bringing that to you too. So thanks for watching.
Max mentioned the whole idea of the plot lines not quite matching up.
Yeah.
Where my mind went right where Rebecca's went, I think, which is where I think for me it was a bit of like the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where you have Lancelot off in the distance approaching the castle.
Yeah.
And then he's approaching the castle, and then he's approaching, and suddenly he's there, right? And he's slaying the guards and everything. Right. It's just very abrupt. It was a little bit like that with the Numenorians showing up. Like they were at sea, and I thought, wow, how are they going to get there in time? They're so far away.
Yeah.
And then suddenly they were like on these horses going toward the village. And so, yeah, I mean, that I had to say to myself, okay, I'm just going to suspend my disbelief here and enjoy this moment. And I tend to have fewer problems with changes from the source material, perhaps. And I'm a very devoted fan of Tolkien's work, but I also feel like an adaptation is an adaptation, and it's a different story in some ways. And I just start out accepting that. So things that I liked, for example, I'll be specific to this episode.
Right. Yes.
There are characters that are created specifically for this show, like Halbrand and Adar. As far as I know. And I like what is being set up through these characters and their relationship, particularly to Galadriel, which is, we have a very different Galadriel here from the one maybe most people are used to seeing if they only know the Peter Jackson films. This is a younger, more brash, less wise Galadriel in many ways. And that's what they're going for, clearly. And I enjoy the relationship that is developing between her and Halbrand. Did they have a kind of a little moment there?
There was something.
Did you pick up that vibe too? There was a little bit of
that end conversation.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of those quieter moments too, where I thought one thing they did well, and I think it was Max that mentioned it earlier, there's a lot of action here, but also they did succeed in getting us some quieter moments, like post-battle conversation there between Galadriel and Halbrand. And I really liked too the thing going on between Galadriel and Adar. And this is definitely a departure from Tolkien, where we have I kind of like, I'm listening to Adar and I'm like, yeah, he's got a point there. The orcs deserve a place too, right? They're creatures. So that's definitely a departure from Tolkien, where there's zero sympathy for orcs. I think it's fair to say. So I'm cool with that though. I think it's actually an interesting. It brings out something interesting to me in Galadriel and in the world. Like, okay, this is a facet to Middle Earth I hadn't thought about a lot, and I like that. That's an interesting presentation there for me.
I love what you said, because I think that you're kind of zeroing in on like probably a couple of the most important changes that if you want to, like, I mean, it's not really that important a lot of times to talk about nitpicky things, but you're talking about characters that have been created completely and how well they're working as character foils, and that's huge. And I thought the same thing about this episode, that one of the things it did really well, and it's probably the biggest departure from Tolkien of the entire season, is getting us to look at things from an orc point of view, or an Uruk point of view.
Yes, Uruk.
And that is something that Tolkien did not do at all. It is really antithetical in a way. Like,
well, if you want to get into it, Tolkien has been very against any kind of point of view from the evil side.
Yeah, I mean, it's evil is fairly, it's a black and white kind of evil for the most part in Tolkien, and here we're asked to think about things with a little bit more shades of gray, and I do like it.
I seem to remember recently seeing in an article like a snippet of a letter, one of Tolkien's many letters, that's been published. And I don't remember the exact wording, but there was something in the snippet where he was saying the orcs shouldn't be seen as nearly as evil, or not as fully evil, wholly evil.
Okay.
That there wasn't, they weren't just about evil.
You know, he was
I
always
can't remember
like
I can't remember how it was said. Yeah.
His own, you know, thoughts on things to some extent. So, you know, maybe that is something that he kind of, you know, evolved to. I mean, I think if you just looked at like what's in the text of the Lord of the Rings, it's pretty black and white. Like, you know, there's nothing in there that makes me think that orcs need to be sympathized with at all. But maybe that idea, you know, was in his mind at some point, in which case, you know, that's fair game too. But I like it either way.
They've taken maybe a seed of an idea, and it's not something that Tolkien did much with, but it came from Tolkien, which is the idea that Adar, you know, and Galadriel talk about, which is that orcs were elves,
right?
You know, and they were twisted by Morgoth as an act of just pure, you know, evil and revenge and all of that, and to create an army. So that being the case, Tolkien doesn't really get into a sympathetic view of the orcs, but there's that seed there, and I think that they're doing something with it, which is kind of cool, you know, to say, okay, well, if orcs are actually elves in origin who were tortured, then you know, why are they not deserving of some kind of understanding and sympathy? So
and if you think about how they began the show too, going back to episode 1, nothing is evil in the beginning, and so they are asking us to think about that, like where you know, where they came from.
I really like that shot of the water falling into Odru, and you know, it reminded me of the shot at the beginning of Two Towers, with Gandalf and the Balrog falling through the hole down into the lake. That was I saw that immediately beneath Moria, beneath Khazad-dûm, right there.
Glenn, spoilers.
Yeah, I know, it's a couple thousand years from now. There was one theme that really stood out to me, and it's when Bronwyn and Theo are talking and saying goodbye before the battle.
Oh, okay.
You know, and he has her repeat that thing. She's, you know, that this shadow will pass.
Yeah.
And the music playing over it.
That was good.
It was so pure. It sounded straight out of Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings compositions.
I think
that for me was one of the most purely Tolkienian moments in this series, was when she was telling him that about, you know, there's a light beyond the shadow. Those were good lines. I like that. I like the way she delivered them. I thought that was a really powerful scene. And visually, I feel like this show that's probably its strongest aspect, is the visuals in general. I feel like that it's for me anyway, all along, I've been pretty impressed. In this particular episode, I thought that some of the fight sequences were actually really good. I enjoyed Arondir was my man, you know, here in this episode.
He was awesome.
It was really awesome. So I thought, wow, okay, this was, you know, as far as that went, really well done. And some of the wounds and stuff. I don't know, you know, I'm not a medical person, but I was definitely wincing when they were taking, you know, the arrow out of Bronwyn and all of that. So, yeah,
they did not hold back on that. I agree. That was a visceral moment. They really did not. I mean, they were showing you like a much more, you know, intense reality of an arrow wound than we usually get in these kinds of things.
There's one line
I will say the one part I love about Adar is you can never tell if he is lying or telling the truth.
And
that's true.
You have to be good at writing to get that amount of, is he lying or not?
It's dialogue and actor, because I'm very impressed with him in this role. I think he's doing a great job.
There's a line of dialogue that didn't completely click for me until I watched it a second time, to watch the episode a second time. And it's used twice in the episode. And it's the opening when Adar's planting those seeds in the ground and buries them and says, "New life in defiance of death." I think that's, I'm paraphrasing. I might be paraphrasing a little bit there.
Are you talking about, because I think.
And then Arondir.
Arondir, you mean, right?
Arondir and Bronwyn are talking, and he gives her those seeds. And she, without prompting, says new life and death, in defiance of death. And I'm just like, she happened to fall on the exact same line that Adar was using, almost like a ritualistic prayer.
I didn't catch that actually.
Yeah, she used the exact same words. I've watched it 3 times now.
I like that line though. That's good.
It is. That's my. I think that might be my favorite. It had the feel
of a ritual, didn't it, Glenn? I mean, it almost felt like a ritualistic sort of thing. Somehow would have both known, I suppose. Maybe that's
which is why maybe she's just instinctively knew. Like happens in fantasy.
I wonder if it is an elven thing. If it is a ritual, I wonder. I mean, Adar would have that from. He was an elf, and I don't know if Arondir might have shared that with Bronwyn, but I don't know. It does have a ritualistic feel. I like it.
That scene though, we talked about earlier, that scene at the end, where fighting in battle beside you, I felt this, and she's like, yeah, I know the same thing. I felt it too. And I'm like, I hope they're not going. That's why it's even on my mind. I never would have thought that until seeing this episode. And I was like,
so the actors are a little cagey when they're asked about it. And they did talk about this episode in particular and the decision to stage their big scene with each other the way that they did, but they're not looking at each other, because they had agreed that whatever they're feeling in that scene is too intense for them to look at each other. And then that would just sort of like cause whatever it is to overflow. So that doesn't have to be romantic, but it is meant to be very intense, whatever it is. So
I would guess that they won't go there simply because of where I think Halbrand's character is going to end up.
What do you think about that? Because I think this episode has brought up lots of conflicting things for people on that.
Yeah. Well, I've been fairly convinced that his is not going to be a good future.
I mean, I don't think too many people think he does have a good future. Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I like him. So, I mean, he's kind of a lovable rogue, but he has shown tendencies that make me think that he could end up, for example, and this is a very common theory, but as one of the Nazgul, for example, or as the king of the Oathbreakers, perhaps, one of the two, seem the most likely outcome for him. And my sense is that he and Galadriel there could be little hinty moments of something, but really they're going to remain friends, I guess, who keep learning from each other in the courses. And there'll be something tragic to that too, because I think this will be a terrible loss for Galadriel if Halbrand indeed goes the way most of us are thinking.
I think you're right.
About the theory that he's Sauron.
Yeah, I was gonna go there too. And the issue
if we believe Adar saying he killed Sauron, that would give us the credit saying why you hate him.
Unbelievable. I mean, so
if he forged
a lot of
the
people
ring.
seem more convinced that some people seem more convinced he's Sauron after this episode. Some people seem convinced that he is not Sauron after this episode. So clearly, I've seen like a very opposite reactions, which I find interesting. The issue I have with him as Sauron, if they were to go that direction, I can see some interesting things about that. But the issue I have is you'd have to be writing Sauron as essentially very repentant and conflicted, because although we've seen Halbrand be manipulative in some scenes, we've also had scenes of him utterly alone where he's clearly conflicted. Like he's not, it's not a situation where you can write a I've been evil all the time, mask off kind of moment, because we've seen him where he's not manipulating anybody and he is truly conflicted. And that
we've seen him where he
a take.
We've seen
Sauron,
him where
he's would be tough to
we've seen him where he's pretty sure nobody else is watching him.
Absolutely.
And still he's sitting there, deep contemplation with a regretful, remorseful, pained look on his face. Yeah. Sauron wouldn't be doing that unless he knew he had people watching him.
It's
agree to disagree on that.
You think they could do like a fully like?
Well, it's the same. It's the same idea of making the stranger Sauron, of making him the 180 of pulling it. Oh, he's actually Sauron. Like he's being led to be like this good guy because he helped the hobbits. So it's the exact same kind of thing. Why would he do this off screen of helping them?
Yeah.
I think it's much more likely, if we're looking for Sauron, that you're going to have a more of an Anatar type situation where he's somewhere among the elves because of what, and this is previous episode, but okay, we're going there.
Go for it. No, bring it in.
Because of the way there are hints that Celebrimbor has ideas that aren't coming from necessarily himself about the mithril, and that's been passed on from him to Gil-galad. It just seems, and I talked about this with AP during our discussion of episode 5, and AP
good conversation,
a very coherent theory about this, that Anatar has been active in poisoning Celebrimbor's mind, and that he's passed that information along to Gil-galad about the mithril. And this is very much a deception and a setup. So if that theory is true, then Halbrand
makes no sense. And I agree with that more than anything, that like, because something has to be going on there. There's some behind the scenes machinations going on there. And obviously Halbrand can't be doing that. So if he's Sauron, who's doing that?
The moment when Arondir figures out, wait, some of these bodies here are not orcs, and they start uncovering the faces, and it's not entirely realistic, but I like the theme that's being introduced in that moment, which is that we humans have the potential for both good and evil within us, and these are our friends, they're our neighbors, they're our relatives, and there's something that just was a little bit more visceral and tragic in that. So I thought that was well done.
I agree. Well. I'd actually forgotten to mention that, but I agree that was a nice little turn there. And you could say that was a predictable moment as well. But again, it's a lot of it's in the execution. And I think it did work, and it thematically was important. So
there was one moment that I found the execution, as you say, not up to par for me. And it was the all hail King of the Southlands moment, from Bronwyn talking to from Bronwyn and the Queen talking to Halbrand saying yes and everybody cheering. Just felt awkward.
So
it was
when I saw that
off there,
when I saw that scene, I wanted that guy from Monty Python, Holy Grail, to come in and talk about the theocracy of the, you can't just hand out kingship from a blade or something.
That
whole dialogue.
That's so I think, but for me, what it was, Glenn, because I had the same feeling, and that's the one scene that if I really had to pick a scene that just didn't quite work for me in this episode, that would be it. And it was because a lot of it is around Halbrand, and it made me sort of like look at him with side eye a little bit of like, okay, I know he was struggling. I know he came to some kind of acceptance at the end of the last episode. And there's the bit that he has with Galadriel where we understand like how much an impact fighting with her had on him. So they are doing all of that to set up that moment. But somehow in that actual scene, it's still, I didn't quite understand how Halbrand was feeling, or like I wasn't quite believing that he would just say that and everyone would react that way. And it seemed a bit abrupt.
I think
go ahead.
I think the roughness in that scene all centers around Charlie Vickers, even though I still think outside of that scene, and this is spoiler for an answer later, he's one of my favorite performances of the episode outside of that movie. Everything else good, but that one moment
where it might be the
like,
writing of that episode, the writing of that part that is just didn't quite have enough there or something. I'm not sure.
Let's see. Elendil made the comment that sailing in, as they were sailing into the sunrise, that for him it felt like night. It kind of almost makes it sound like the sun itself, in a way, is deceiving Elendil. I mean, it's just, ooh, Kitty. Hi,
I'm not
Kitty.
really listening to you anymore, Glenn, because there's a cat on screen.
Hi there, Kitty. Loss. Theo talked a lot about loss with his feelings over the hill. That really made me think of, his feelings towards the hill. really made me think of all the ring bearers' feelings towards the One Ring.
Yeah.
You know, it was a very similar,
Very deliberate, like in the lines that Arondir had to him, they're making that connection. They're very clear in my mind about like, be rid of it, you know, like, or in the
Yeah.
idea of giving it to the Numenorians to toss into the ocean, because that was certainly discussed about doing to the One Ring. You know,
Yep.
can you be rid of it that way? And there was also the scene where Arondir was trying to destroy it, and he's like, well, we don't have the means to do this. So they were drawing lots of parallels there between that key and the One Ring, and Theo's relationship to it specifically. When it comes to the sort of good versus, you know, evil question, to get like a little bit more specific, I think for Galadriel, there's the question of like, when does good become indistinguishable from evil? You know, when does your method and your approach in fighting evil make you indistinguishable from evil itself? And I think that's an important question.
And we've been seeing that one since episode 1 with Galadriel.
Well, she brought it back in last episode as well, not so much directly, but indirectly, when she was saying to Halbrand that admitting that she thought that her friends couldn't distinguish her from the evil she was fighting. And then we see that like mirror held up to her directly with Adar basically saying that to her, you know, like, are you sure you're not Morgoth's successor? Maybe you should be looking at yourself.
She was ready to torture her. She was ready to torture her, a prisoner, a helpless prisoner, right?
Right.
I like that little bit of an Easter egg in the dialogue there, talking to Galadriel, saying, your mirror. It's just, I mean, there's a chapter. Isn't that the name of the chapter takes place in? Mirror of Galadriel. So it's like, talking to Galadriel, and you say, look in your mirror. I'm like, clever.
Yeah, there's an introduction of nuance, I think, here a little bit. Something that for some reason really stuck out to me was the fact that the humans took some orc prisoners. And you don't see that usually. They just, you know, you don't think about orcs as prisoners, because are orcs ever prisoners? They just slaughter them, and nobody thinks about it, right?
Always writes either that they're all dead, or the ones that aren't dead flee. It's always like that. They kill a certain number of them, and then the rest flee, and that's it.
And they keep killing the ones who are fleeing too.
And by having orcs being prisoners, I feel like that is asking for a little more sympathy for them, perhaps, or that they're worthy of being kept alive as prisoners. Yeah.
The reverse has also happened too, where Arondir was a prisoner, and Adar didn't kill him, let him leave as a messenger. And we really only see that in the Lord of the Rings when they've captured Merry and Pippin under specific orders of, you know, don't kill them because we might really need them for something, not because they're halflings and we shouldn't just slaughter them indiscriminately. Like, no, they wanted to, but they had specific orders. Otherwise, orcs don't take prisoners either.
There's a silver lining to taking these orcs prisoner right after a battle. You're not going to have a hard time feeding them. There's a lot of meat laying around. They're orcs. You know, meat's back on the table, boys.